What Stalin did when Israel's creation was opposed by Britain and America. It is the autumn of 1947, and the United Nations is about to vote on the future of Palestine. The vote will determine whether the British Mandate territory of Palestine, which the Ottoman Empire controlled before the First World War, and which the League of Nations assigned to Britain for administration after it, will be partitioned into separate Jewish and Arab states, or whether the partition proposal will fail, and the question of Palestine's future will be left to the specific resolution that the British departure and the Arab-Jewish conflict on the ground will produce, without the international framework of a United Nations decision. The partition vote's outcome is not certain. The uncertainty is produced by the specific geometry of the United Nations General Assembly's membership in the autumn of 1947 and by the specific positions that the major powers are taking in the months before the vote. Positions that are not the positions that the simplest reading of the Cold War's alignment would predict, and that are not the positions that the subsequent history of American-Israeli relations and Soviet-Israeli relations suggests were the natural expressions of each power's interests. The position that is most surprising, the position that the subsequent history has most consistently obscured in the simple narrative of American support for Israel as the defining feature of the new state's international support, is the Soviet position. The Soviet Union supports partition, not reluctantly, not as the tactical calculation of a moment whose strategic logic will be reversed when the moment's requirements change, as the active and effective diplomatic support of a major power, whose vote in the General Assembly and whose diplomacy in the corridors of the United Nations and whose public statements at the Security Council and the General Assembly are among the most consequential contributions to the partition resolution's passage. What Stalin did when Israel's creation was opposed by Britain and America is what this video is about, and the doing is more significant and more complicated than the historical narrative that has settled around the American-Israeli relationship's subsequent dominance has allowed most people to understand. To understand what Stalin did, you need to understand what Britain and America were doing in the period between 1945 and 1948, and why their positions on Palestine and on Jewish immigration to Palestine and on the partition proposal are the positions that the Soviet support's significance requires as context. Britain's position. Britain in 1945 is the exhausted imperial power that the Second World War has left managing an empire whose resources the war has consumed and whose political foundations the war has accelerated the erosion of. The British Empire in 1945 is an empire that is in the process of becoming something smaller and different, and whose management requires the specific calculation of which commitments can be maintained and which must be surrendered, and in what sequence the surrendering must occur to minimize the strategic damage that the surrendering produces. Palestine in this calculation is the commitment that intersects with the most sensitive set of British strategic interests in the region, the interests in Arab goodwill and in the oil revenues and the access rights and the political relationships with the Arab governments whose support British regional strategy requires. The British position on Palestine in the post-war period is the position of a government that is managing the impossible tension between the Balfour Declaration's 1917 promise of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine and the White Paper of 1939's severe restriction of Jewish immigration to Palestine that the Arab-majority population's opposition to Jewish immigration has produced as the specific instrument of British appeasement of Arab political concerns. The White Paper limits Jewish immigration to Palestine to 15,000 persons per year during the 5-year period following its issue, and contemplates the end of Jewish immigration entirely thereafter without Arab consent. 15,000 per year. In the period following the war's end, the Jewish displaced persons who are living in the camps of Europe and who are trying to reach Palestine are being stopped by the British Navy and the British Army and the British administrative apparatus that is enforcing the White Paper's restrictions against the specific pressure of the Jewish displaced persons' attempts to reach the land that the Balfour Declaration promised would be available to them. The British are stopping the ships. The ships are carrying the survivors of the European Jewish communities whose destruction the war has produced, survivors who have been living in the displaced persons camps of Germany and Austria and Italy for months and in some cases years, and whose choice of destination is Palestine, because Palestine is the destination that the Zionist movement has been preparing and that the Balfour Declaration promised and that the White Paper is now preventing. the British are stopping them. The images of the British Navy intercepting ships carrying Jewish displaced persons and returning them to Cyprus or to Germany are the images that the international press is producing in 1946 and 1947 and that are building the specific international political pressure on Britain to resolve the Palestine question that the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry of 1946 and the UNSCOP of 1947 are the institutional expressions of. The American position. America's position on Palestine in 1945 and 1946 and 1947 is the position that is most consequential for the partition resolution's eventual outcome, and that is most complicated in the specific way that American domestic politics and American strategic interests in the region are pulling in different directions. The American domestic political pressure for the admission of Jewish displaced persons to Palestine is real, and it is organized, and it is expressed through the specific channels that the American political system provides for the expression of constituent concerns, the lobbying and the electoral pressure, and the congressional communications that the American Jewish community's political organization is capable of producing in the specific direction of the Palestine question's resolution in favor of the Jewish displaced persons immigration. Harry Truman is managing this pressure. He is managing it as the president who reads the Harrison Report in August 1945 and writes to Attlee requesting the immediate admission of 100,000 Jewish displaced persons to Palestine, whose request produces the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, whose report in April 1946 recommends the immediate admission of 100,000, and whose recommendation Truman endorses publicly and immediately. The endorsement is genuine. Truman genuinely wants the 100,000 admitted and genuinely wants the Palestine question resolved in a way that the Jewish displaced persons situation can be addressed. The endorsement is also incomplete. The incomplete part is the gap between Truman's public support for the 100,000's admission and the American diplomatic support for the partition solution that the 100,000's admission implies. The gap between wanting the displaced persons to reach Palestine and being willing to apply the full weight of American diplomatic pressure to the international process that creates the state that the displaced persons are trying to reach. The State Department. The State Department in 1947 is the institution whose professional assessment of American strategic interests in the Middle East produces the strongest internal resistance to the American diplomatic support for partition that Truman's personal sympathy with the Jewish displaced persons situation is generating as the presidential impulse toward the UN vote's outcome. The State Department's assessment is the assessment of the Near East Division, whose professional analysts and whose diplomatic corps in the Arab capitals are producing the specific analysis that the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states will produce the Arab world's response of hostility to American interests in the region, and that the hostility will express itself in the specific forms of oil access complications and strategic partnership withdrawals and the Soviet penetration of the Arab states, whose antipathy to American Palestine policy creates the opening for Soviet influence that the Cold War strategic framework identifies as the primary regional threat. The State Department wants an alternative to partition. The alternatives they propose, trusteeship and federation, and the various other arrangements that the State Department's planning produces in the period between the Anglo-American Committee's report and the November 1947 partition vote, are the alternatives that the Jewish Agency and the Zionist movement reject, because they are the alternatives that do not produce the Jewish state that the movement has been building toward since the First Zionist Congress of 1897. The State Department is not the only American institution whose position on partition is less supportive than the partition resolution's eventual passage requires. The Defense Department. The American Defense Department's assessment of partition's strategic consequences is the assessment of a military establishment that is looking at the Middle East through the lens of the Cold War military competition with the Soviet Union, and that is identifying the Arab states' military significance, the access to bases and the overland routes, and the strategic position relative to the Soviet Union's southern border, as the strategic asset whose preservation requires the management of the Palestine question in a way that does not produce the Arab hostility that partition is predicted to generate. The American military is not enthusiastic about partition. The CIA. The CIA's assessments of the partition proposal's implementation prospects. It are assessments that the specific military balance between the Jewish and Arab forces in Palestine produces as the framework for the prediction that the partition resolution's passage will be followed by the Arab military response that will test the Jewish forces' ability to defend the state that the resolution has created. The CIA's assessments in the period between the partition resolution's passage in November 1947 and the Israeli Declaration of Independence in May 1948 are assessments whose specific content the American arms embargo that the United States maintains throughout this period reflects as the policy expression of the doubt that the Jewish forces' military capability will be sufficient to defend the new state against the Arab army's attack. The American arms embargo. The United States maintains an arms embargo on the Middle East throughout the period between November 1947 and the Israeli Declaration of Independence in May 1948. The embargo applies to both sides. In practice, it applies most constrainingly to the Jewish forces, whose access to weapons through the channels that the British mandate's administrative structure and the Arab states' existing military establishments provide to the Arab side is more limited than the Arab side's access. The American arms embargo in this period is the most direct expression of the American ambivalence about partition's implementation, the ambivalence that the State Department's strategic assessment and the Defense Department's military concerns and the CIA's capability doubts produces the specific gap between Truman's personal sympathy and the American government's operational support for the Jewish state's creation. Stalin's position. Stalin's position on the Palestine question in 1947 and 1948 is the position that requires the most careful examination because it is the position that is most counterintuitive from the perspective of the Cold War's subsequent history and from the perspective of the Soviet Union's subsequent relationship to Israel and to the Arab states. The Soviet Union in the subsequent Cold War years is the patron of the Arab states that are fighting Israel in the 1967 war and the 1973 war, the supplier of the weapons and the diplomatic support that make the Soviet-Arab relationship the defining alignment of the Middle East's Cold War geopolitics. The Soviet Union in 1947 is doing something different. In 1947, the Soviet Union is the most vocal and most consistent major power supporter of the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Why? The why of the Soviet partition support is the question whose multiple components the historical analysis of the period produces, as the specific combination of strategic calculation and ideological framework and tactical opportunity that Stalin's foreign policy produces when it is applied to the Palestine question. The first component is the British. Stalin's primary strategic objective in the Middle East in the late 1940s is the reduction of British influence in the region. Britain is the imperial power whose control of the Middle East's strategic geography, the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf and the overland routes and the military bases, represents the specific obstacle to Soviet access to the warm water ports and the regional influence that the Soviet strategic framework identifies as the primary objectives of Soviet Middle East policy. Palestine is British mandatory territory. The partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states ends the British mandate. The end of the British mandate removes Britain from Palestine as a governing power. The removal of Britain from Palestine as a governing power is the reduction of British influence in the region that Stalin's primary strategic objective requires. Supporting partition is supporting the end of the British mandate. The British are opposing partition. Britain's opposition to partition is the opposition of a mandatory power that wants to manage the transition from the mandate in a way that preserves its regional relationships and its strategic position. A managed transition that the partition's specific form of international pressure for implementation prevents by removing the British discretion about the timing and the character of the mandate's end. Stalin's support for partition is simultaneously the support for the Jewish state's creation and the support for the British mandate's end. The two are not separable. The second component is the Americans. Stalin's support for partition in 1947 is the support that the American ambivalence about partition's implementation is making the most consequential international backing for the resolution's passage, because the American ambivalence's expression through the arms embargo and the State Department's alternative proposals is producing the specific gap in the diplomatic coalition for partition that the Soviet support is filling. A partition vote in the General Assembly requires a two-thirds majority. The Soviet Union's 5 votes, the Soviet Union itself, and the 3 Soviet republics that the Yalta Agreement has given seats in the General Assembly, Ukraine and Belarusia, are 5 votes in the direction of the two-thirds majority that the partition resolution requires. They are also the cover for the Eastern European states whose positions on the Palestine question the Soviet relationship allows the Soviet side to influence, the specific diplomatic coalition whose assembly the Soviet partition support helps to organize in the corridors of the United Nations in the weeks before the November 29th vote. The third component is the Jews. Stalin's calculation about the Jewish population of Palestine and the Jewish population of the Soviet Union and the Jewish population of the Eastern European states that are coming under Soviet influence in the post-war period is the calculation that the partition question's relationship to Soviet interests in the Jewish population produces. The Jewish population of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is a population whose political sympathies and whose organizational capabilities and whose international connections the Soviet security apparatus has been managing since the revolution, with the specific combination of utilization and suspicion that the Soviet system brings to every minority population whose characteristics are simultaneously useful and threatening. The Jewish population's international connections, the connections to the Jewish diaspora in the United States and in Western Europe and in Palestine, are the connections that the Soviet intelligence apparatus has been utilizing through the various organizations and individuals whose relationship to both the Soviet system and the international Jewish community provides the specific intelligence value that the Soviet system extracts from the relationship. The Zionist movement's relationship to these connections is the relationship of a political movement whose international organization and fundraising and diplomatic activities represent a form of transnational political action that the Soviet system finds simultaneously useful in the specific context of the Palestine question and threatening in the specific context of the Soviet Jewish population's potential loyalty to a Jewish state rather than to the Soviet state. Stalin's support for the Jewish state in 1947 is not the expression of sympathy for the Jewish people. It is the expression of a strategic calculation that the Jewish state's creation serves Soviet interests in the specific configuration of 1947. The Andrei Gromyko speech, the specific expression of the Soviet position on partition that the historical record preserves as the most complete and most eloquent statement of the Soviet case for the Jewish state, is the speech that Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet representative to the United Nations, delivers to the General Assembly on May 14, 1947. Gromyko's speech is remarkable for its specific content and for the specific historical context that its content addresses. He speaks about the Jewish people's historical experience. He speaks about the specific suffering that the Jewish communities of Europe have experienced in the period of the war, the destruction of those communities and the fate of the survivors who have no home to return to, and whose presence in the displaced persons camps of Europe represents the specific humanitarian emergency that the Palestine question's resolution is supposed to address. He speaks about the Jewish people's historical connection to Palestine. He speaks about the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine and about the specific impossibility of the coexistence solution that the British Mandates administration has been attempting to produce. The impossibility that the violence of the 1936 to 1939 Arab revolt and the subsequent violence of the post-war period has documented with the specific evidence of communities that cannot govern themselves collectively. He reaches the conclusion. The Soviet Union, he says, supports the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states as the specific solution that the humanitarian emergency of the Jewish displaced persons and the political impossibility of the unified state solution together require. The speech is the most explicit Soviet endorsement of the Jewish state's creation that the International Forum of the United Nations produces in this period, and it is delivered with the specific rhetorical force of a man whose government has made the calculation that the speech's content serves Soviet interests and whose delivery reflects the specific investment of a major power in the diplomatic outcome the speech is supporting. The speech is received by the Jewish agency's representatives and by the Zionist movement's international leadership, with the specific combination of surprise and relief that the Soviet position's unexpectedness produces in people who have been managing the Palestine question, in the specific expectation that the Soviet Union's Cold War alignment would produce opposition rather than support. The Czech weapons. The Soviet support for the Jewish state's creation is not limited to the diplomatic expression of the Gromyko speech and the General Assembly vote. It extends to the most consequential practical support that the Jewish forces in Palestine receive in the period between the partition resolution's passage in November 1947 and the Arab army's invasion in May 1948. The weapons. The Czech weapons pipeline is the supply line whose opening and whose operation represent the most direct practical expression of the Soviet support for the Jewish state's creation that the 1947 to 1948 period produces. Czechoslovakia in 1948 is the Eastern European state whose government the Soviet-supported communist coup of February 1948 has brought into the Soviet orbit. The state whose foreign policy the Soviet relationship now influences in the specific direction that Soviet interests require. Soviet interests require the Czech weapons to reach Palestine. The Czech weapons include the Avia S-199 aircraft, the Czech-manufactured version of the German Messerschmitt Bf-109. That is the only combat aircraft available to the Israeli Air Force in the period when the Arab air forces are conducting bombing raids on Tel Aviv, and whose availability represents the specific military capability difference between an Israeli military that has air cover and an Israeli military that does not. The Czech weapons include rifles and machine guns and artillery that the Israeli military needs to face the 5 Arab armies whose invasion begins on May 15, 1948, the day after Ben-Gurion declares independence. The Czech weapons arrived during the first United Nations truce of June 1948. The truce that both sides are supposed to be using for humanitarian purposes and that the Israeli side is using for military resupply with the Czech weapons that the Soviet relationship is facilitating and that the truce's formal provisions are supposed to prevent. The Czech weapons change the war. The military historians of the 1948 war have examined the specific impact of the Czech weapons on the Israeli military's capability in the war's critical phases, with the conclusion that the weapons' arrival represents the material difference between an Israeli military that can sustain the defensive operations that the Arab army's invasion requires it to conduct, and an Israeli military that cannot sustain those operations without the replacement of the equipment that the fighting is consuming. The Czech weapons come from the Soviet orbit, with Soviet knowledge, with Soviet permission, with Soviet facilitation of the specific logistical arrangements that the weapons movement from Czech arsenals to the ships and aircraft that carry them to Israel requires. Stalin is arming Israel. The United States is maintaining the arms embargo. The specific irony of the 1948 period is the specific inversion of what the subsequent decades of the American-Israeli relationship and the Soviet-Arab relationship suggest about which superpower is supporting which side. In 1948, the Soviet Union is providing the weapons that the Israeli military needs to survive. In 1948, the United States is maintaining the embargo that is preventing the Israeli military from receiving the American weapons that the subsequent relationship's character suggests should have been arriving. The voting at the United Nations. The General Assembly vote on the partition resolution on November 29, 1947, produces the 33-13 result, with 10 abstentions, that the partition resolution's 2/3 majority requirement is met by in the specific form of the most consequential United Nations vote in the organization's history. The Soviet Union votes yes. The United States votes yes. The votes are both yes, but they are not both yes in the same way. The American yes is the yes of a government whose internal divisions about partition's wisdom and whose strategic concerns about its regional consequences have been managed into the specific public expression of the yes vote by the combination of Truman's personal commitment and the American Jewish community's political pressure and the specific last-week diplomatic maneuvering that produces the wavering vote's conversion to yes in the days before the vote is called. The American yes is the yes that has required the management of the internal divisions that the State Department and the Defense Department and the CIA have been expressing in various forms throughout the period of the partition resolution's consideration. The Soviet yes is a different kind of yes. It is the yes of a government whose position has been consistent from the earliest stages of the United Nations consideration of the Palestine question, whose diplomatic corps at the United Nations has been working in the corridors to build the coalition for partition, and whose statements at the General Assembly have been the most explicit and the most rhetorically invested in the Jewish state's creation of any major power. The Soviet yes does not require the management of internal divisions. Stalin has made the calculation. The calculation serves Soviet interests. The yes is the instrument of the calculation, the recognition. The Soviet Union recognizes Israel on May 17, 1948, 2 days after the Israeli Declaration of Independence. 11 minutes after the United States provides the first recognition, the de facto recognition that Truman announces on May 14, 1948, over the State Department's objections. The Soviet recognition is the de jure recognition, the full legal recognition that the international law of state recognition distinguishes from the de facto recognition that the United States provides. The Soviet recognition is fuller than the American recognition. In the first days of Israeli statehood, the Soviet Union is more fully committed to the new state's international legal standing than the United States is. This is the specific historical fact that the American-Israeli relationship's subsequent dominance has most completely obscured, the reversal. The Soviet support for Israel's creation and early survival is not permanent. Stalin's calculation changes. The calculation changes as the specific features of the Israeli state's character and its international orientation become clearer in the period between 1948 and Stalin's death in 1953. The Israeli state's orientation is toward the West. The Israeli state's political character is the democratic character of a state that has been built by the Zionist movement's engagement with the Western democratic tradition and the labor movement's social democratic values and the liberal political culture of the diaspora communities whose organization has been the Zionist movement's primary resource. It is not the Soviet character. The Jewish immigration to Israel from the Soviet Union and the Eastern European states that Stalin was hoping to facilitate through the Soviet support for the Jewish state's creation is not happening at the scale that the calculation anticipated, partly because the Soviet system's restrictions on emigration prevent the Jewish population from leaving in the numbers that the Israeli state would welcome. The Israeli state is not becoming the Soviet client that the calculation assumed the Soviet support would produce. The Arab states whose hostility to Israel is the product of the 1948 war are becoming the states whose relationship to the Soviet Union the reversed calculation produces as the more valuable strategic alignment. Stalin turns. The reversal is not immediate, and it is not complete in Stalin's lifetime, which ends in March 1953, but the specific trajectory of the Soviet-Israeli relationship's deterioration in the period between 1949 and 1953 and the specific trajectory of the Soviet-Arab relationship's development in the same period are the trajectories whose subsequent decades produce the Cold War Middle East that the simple narrative of American-Israeli alliance and Soviet-Arab alliance describes. But in 1947 and 1948, the simple narrative is not yet the reality. The reality in 1947 and 1948 is the Soviet Union providing the diplomatic support and the practical military assistance that Israel's creation requires at the specific moment when the British are maintaining the white paper and the Americans are maintaining the arms embargo and the Arab armies are preparing the invasion. What Stalin did when Israel's creation was opposed by Britain and America is support it, actively, consistently, practically, with weapons, with votes, with the specific calculation of a man who understood that the British mandate's end served Soviet interests, and that the Jewish state whose creation the mandate's end would produce was the instrument of that interest in the specific moment of 1947 and 1948. The interest changed, the support ended, but the state was created. And the weapons that Stalin allowed to move through the Czech pipeline are the weapons that the Israeli military used to survive the five armies' invasion in the war that the partition resolution produced. The state exists because those weapons arrived. The weapons arrived because Stalin calculated that their arrival served his interests. The calculation's motivation is not what the result suggests, but the result is the result, and the result is Israel.